Part 1. The night falls over the Arctic steppeth last light of the Arctic sun. Barely touched the horizon before it was swallowed by an ocean of shadow. AT-71C. Darkness does not simply rive, it conquers. Every exhaled breath became a plume of ice, hanging in the air like smoke before drifting away into the endless white. The snow beneath my boots squeaked sharply, a sound unique to the deep cold. Each step ringing out like glass breaking far away in the distance. The Chum tents stood like dark cones against the pale expanse, their reindeer hide walls already rimmed with frost. Round them, the nomads moved slowly but with purpose, their fur hoods pulled tight, eyes narrowed against the wind. Every action was deliberate here. Haste was dangerous in the cold. A forgotten glove, a dropped tool. Such mistakes could mean frostbite before you had time to correct them. Reindeer stood in a loose semicircle near the tethering posts, their thick coats already powdered with ice crystals. A few shook their massive antlers, sending a glittering spray into the air. The animal's breath rose in thick clouds, mingling with the low smoke curling from the tent flaps. The smell of burning larch and birch drifted across the camp, a promise of warmth within. The sky deepened to a violet black, and the first stars began to burn overhead, sharp as needles. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled, its cry carrying unnervingly. Clear in the brittle night air, the nomads didn't pause. Predators were a fact of life here, and tonight, the cold was the greater enemy. I followed a family as they moved toward their chum, the mother carrying a bundle of wood, the father, a pair of frozen fish for the evening meal. The children, no older than 8 or 9, each held a small sack of reindeer dung, fuel for the stove once the wood burned low. Inside the tent's entrance, the world changed instantly. The harsh wind vanished, replaced by the muffled quiet of reindeer hide walls. The interior was dim, lit only by the orange glow of a central fire. Thick felt and fur lined the ground, forming a barrier between sleeping bodies and the frozen earth. A metal stove pipe rose through the roof hole, and next to it hung strips of drying fish and meat, their surfaces white with frost. The air was warmer here, but not warm, just enough to keep your breath from crystallizing the moment it left your lips. In the corner, the eldest grandmother sat cross-legged on a folded reindeer hide, her hands busy weaving a small rope from sinew. She looked up and smiled faintly, a face carved with decades of cold winds and snow. Outside, the darkness had fully claimed the steppe, and the only light left was the fire's steady heart inside the chum. The family settled in, removing their outer fur coats but keeping thick boots and gloves on. The temperature inside might be bearable, but the cold seeped into every corner, and no one here took chances. Tea was poured from a dented metal kettle, steaming into the dim air. It sent a mix of smoke, tannin, and something faintly sweet in. This place, night was not something you simply slept through. It was something you survived. Part 2. Inside the Chum 10th Chum was more than a shelter. It was a world within a world, a fragile sphere of life carved out of the frozen void. The fire in the center crackled softly, each pop sending sparks up toward the smoke hole. Above, the circle of open sky framed by the tent's peak showed a scattering of stars, blurred by drifting wood smoke. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but here only its muffled roar could be heard, pressing against the hides. The family moved in quiet rhythm. The father knelt by the stove, breaking up chunks of frozen fish with a small axe. There was no such thing as thawed food here, not at -71°C. The mother fed thin strips into a battered iron pot, where they hissed and sizzled in fat saved from the autumn hunts. The children helped by passing bundles of dry twigs and handfuls of crushed reindeer dung, which burned slow and steady when the wood began to run low. Every space inside the chum had a purpose. The wall hides, layered in 2 or even 3 thicknesses, acted as insulation against the cold. Along the inner walls, low platforms of packed snow were covered in thick reindeer skins for sleeping. Above these hung small bags of food, spare mittens, and tools, everything suspended to keep it away from rodents that sometimes wandered in during the night, seeking warmth. The grandmother hummed quietly as she worked on a fur mitten, her needle made from reindeer bone and thread from sinew. Her hands moved with the speed of someone who had done this thousands of times before. She paused only to pour herself more tea from the kettle, adding a pinch of dried herbs gathered in the brief summer. I realized quickly that inside did not mean warm, even with the fire going. The air was cold enough to sting my fingers. If I removed my gloves for too long, the stove was a constant demand, feed it every few minutes, or the temperature would plunge. The nomads didn't measure warmth in degrees. They measured it in how long they could sit without shivering. Dinner was simple: fish soup so hot it steamed against the frigid air, small chunks of meat dried from the last hunt, and pieces of hard bread softened in the broth each bite carried. The taste of smoke and survival. The children slurped eagerly, then curled near their grandmother, pulling furs around themselves. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the tent poles like an impatient hand. There was no clock here, only the sense of time passing by the rhythm of the fire and the slow arc of stars overhead. The father took a moment to step outside, pulling the flap closed quickly to keep the precious heat in. When he returned, he brushed snow from his hood and muttered something in Yakut. The storm was worsening. The air inside grew thick with smoke, forcing everyone to keep low to the ground where it was easier to breathe. My eyes watered, but no one else seemed bothered. They had long since learned the balance between too much smoke and too much cold. The smoke was more than just an annoyance. It kept the worst of the frost from forming inside the tent, coating every surface with ice crystals that could melt and freeze again, rotting the hides over time. When the meal was finished, the pot was set back on the edge of the stove, ready to be reheated for breakfast. The children crawled under layered hides, disappearing into small mounds like sleeping animals. The adults settled near the fire, boots still on, ready to wake at any moment if the wind tore at the tent. The grandmother spoke softly, telling a story about a winter long ago when the temperature dropped so far. The reindeer's breath froze to their nostrils, sealing them shut. The only thing that saved them was the men's quick work to break the ice free before the animals suffocated. Her voice was steady, but the message was clear here. Even the smallest detail could mean life or death. The tent shifted slightly under a sudden gust, and a fine dusting of frost fell from the hides above, sparkling briefly in the firelight, before vanishing into the shadows. I realized then that the Chum was not a fortress. It was a skin-thin barrier between the people inside and a world that could kill them in minutes. And tonight, that world was pressing in on every side. Part 3. Surviving the Arctic. Cold night in the Arctic is not the absence of light. It is the presence of something heavier. It presses down on you, thick and infinite, swallowing the horizon. Inside the Chum, the firelight flickered on the hide walls, casting the shapes of people, tools, and antlers into long, trembling shadows. Every few minutes, the wind outside would shift, and the whole tent would groan like the hull of a ship at sea. The family knew the storm was worsening. You could hear it in the tone of the wind, not a constant howl, but a shifting roar, as if unseen hands were shaking the very air every time the tent poles creaked. I imagined the hides tearing loose, the snow pouring in, the warmth fleeing. Instantly, the father didn't sleep. He sat with his boots planted firmly on the packed snow floor, feeding the stove every few minutes. The fire was no luxury. It was a chain that kept everyone tethered to life. The fuel was precious, drywood brought in on sleds during summer, small bundles of willow branches and reindeer dung, pressed and dried during warmer months. Every log was measured against the night's length. I lay under reindeer hides, so thick they felt like the weight of the land itself. But still, the cold crept in. It moved through the seams, through the floor, through the breath in the air. My eyelashes began to stick together from frost, and each inhale burned my lungs, as if I were breathing in shards of glass. Sleeping here wasn't about comfort. It was about slowing the body down enough that it didn't burn through its last reserves of heat. At one point, the father nudged the mother awake. She reached under a sleeping platform and pulled out a flat metal kettle, half filled with snow. It was set near the stove to melt, then poured into small cups with tea leaves. The warm liquid didn't just warm the body, it woke the spirit. In a place where the air could kill you faster than hunger, hot tea was a form of defense. The grandmother stirred and began her quiet work again, mending a torn seam on a pair of boots. Her hands were cracked and scarred from years of handling hides in the cold, yet they moved as steadily as if it were midday in summer. The rhythm of her work was a comfort, proof that life still had small, controllable things even in the middle of a -71°C storm. Then came the sound, a sharp, snapping crack from outside, not the poles, not the hides, but the ice itself. The father froze, listening. He pulled on his mittens and stepped out, letting in a brief knife blade gust that stole the air from my lungs. When he returned, his hood was crusted with white. He said a few short words. Part of the reindeer herd had broken from the main group. Spooked by the storm, they drifted toward the frozen river. No one spoke for a moment. The mother ladled out more soup from the pot, as if keeping her hands busy could keep the thought away that if the wind shifted again, those reindeer could be lost to the darkness forever. In this world, losing even a few meant losing transport, food, and fur for the season ahead. The father didn't go back to sitting. He began to pack a small bundle, rope, a lantern, a curved wooden pole for catching animals. His face was calm, but his eyes were set. In these temperatures, rescue was measured in minutes, not hours. I tried to sleep again, but my mind replayed the same thought. Here, survival is not a single act. It's a chain of choices, each one keeping you just one step ahead of the cold. Keep the fire burning, keep the hides tight, keep the herd close. If one link breaks, the night takes everything. The wind rose to a pitch that made the poles hum, and tiny flecks of snow began to fall through the smoke hole, each one melting into the fur blankets. The air smelled of smoke, pine, and the sharp tang of frost. Somewhere in that endless dark, the missing reindeer were out there, warm-blooded specks in an ocean of frozen silence. Inside, we waited, each breath a reminder that for now, we were still alive. Part 4. The Arctic morning after. By the time the first hint of light bled into the Arctic sky, the storm had begun to loosen its grip. The wind, which had screamed like a living thing all night, now sighed and muttered, as though it had exhausted itself in the battle. The hides of the Chum still rattled with every gust, but there was a difference. The sound no longer carried that razor edge that made you tense with each passing minute. I opened my eyes to a room washed in a dull, bluish half-light. The fire in the stove had burned low, leaving the air heavy with the smell of charred wood and boiled tea. Frost had crept further down the poles during the night, forming a crystalline skin over the raw wood. The grandmother was already awake, pouring the last of the melted snow into the kettle. The mother moved slowly, as if her joints had stiffened from the cold. She stepped outside briefly, her breath billowing out in thick clouds, and when she came back she was cradling a block of frozen fish wrapped in hide. Without a word, she set it near the stove to thaw for breakfast. Out here, food wasn't so much prepared as it was released from the ice's grip, but the father was still gone. It was impossible not to keep glancing at the tent flap, expecting it to lift and reveal his bulky figure. Every few minutes, the grandmother would tilt her head toward the door, listening. I wondered if she could hear something I couldn't, the distant jingle of a reindeer bell, the crunch of boots over snow. The hours stretched, the kettle hissed, the fire popped, and the smell of fish soup began to mingle with the sharp scent of smoke. I could feel the cold seeping back into my bones every time the stove's flames dipped. Then, at last, the flap moved. The father stepped in, carrying his rope and lantern, both stiff with frost. His face was darkened with fatigue, his cheeks raw and red from the wind, but in his eyes there was relief. Behind him, a thin figure followed, the eldest son, also bundled in furs, holding a lead rope, and on the other end of that rope, heads bobbing and ears twitching, were two of the missing reindeer. Only two. The father lowered himself onto a stool, his hands shaking as he stripped off his mittens. He spoke little, only that they had found part of the missing group, but had been forced to turn back when the cold grew too dangerous. He believed the others might still be alive, farther upriver, but it would take another day before it was safe to search again. The mother served him a bowl of soup, the steam curling up into the frozen air. He didn't wait for it to cool. He drank in large gulps, as though willing the warmth into his core. When the family finally sat together, Eating in silence, I realized how small the victory was, and yet how enormous it felt. In a place where the land itself seemed eager to erase you, saving even to animals was a statement. We are still here. After breakfast, the father went outside again. I followed him, pulling my hood tight. The world beyond the Chum was alien, an unbroken white plain under a pale, low sun. The snowdrifts were sculpted into ridges and hollows, and the air was so cold that my breath fell to the ground like smoke. The reindeer stood huddled near a windbreak of piled snow, their sides steaming faintly. The father checked each one's legs and hooves for frostbite, running his hands over them with a tenderness that seemed almost human. Overhead, the Arctic sky was still streaked with thin clouds, but beyond them was that deep, endless blue that only comes after a storm. It was beautiful, but it wasn't gentle. It was the beauty of survival, sharp-edged and unyielding. We stayed outside only as long as our breath didn't burn too much, then returned to the warmth of the tent. Inside, the mother had begun sewing new straps for the sled harness. Already preparing for the next journey, the grandmother had poured tea again. The rhythm of life here was simple, but it never paused. Storm or no storm, cold or no cold, the work had to go on. As I sat with my cup, the thought settled over me. This was what life at -71°C really meant. Not just enduring the night, but meeting the morning still able to act, to plan, to care for those around you, human and animal alike. In the Arctic, survival isn't just measured by who lives through the storm. It's measured by who still has the strength to face the next one.